Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you might be. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm honored to welcome you here to a timely and important conversation, Campus Anti-Semitism and Campus Speech. We will be led in conversation by my dear friend Michael Helland, a colleague over at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law, where he's the Brendan Mann Chair of Law and Religion. Eliza D. Lewin is the president of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights, and Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute. I wanted to start with just a couple introductory remarks from our perspective here at the School of Public Policy. The Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on October 7th will go down not only as a watershed event in the history of the Middle East, but of world history. But in no sector has the impact been felt here in the United States, within our own civil society, than in American higher education. Obviously, in the weeks since October 7th, we have all been witness to the protests involving students, faculty, administrators, on a number of college campuses, not just at elite institutions, but at various colleges, universities, community colleges, high schools, various institutes of education throughout the country. The recent congressional testimony by 3 Ivy League presidents again has brought these issues to the fore. And in wondering and debating issues related not only to speech, but to how we understand anti-Semitism, I thought I'd draw from a recent piece in the Boston Globe that came out today, in which the editorial board said, and I quote, "In an instance that required moral clarity, the presidents of these 3 Ivy League institutions decided to move more towards legal ambiguity in defense of their own institutions." How we understand these matters, not only of speech, but of anti-Semitism, and the fact that this is happening particularly on American higher education colleges and universities, is really the subject for today's discussion. Now, you might be wondering, why does the School of Public Policy care about such things? And I would just enter in to the discussion. We care for these matters for really 2 main reasons. First, as one of the very few graduate policy programs grounded in the Judeo-Christian roots of American institutions of freedom and democracy, we care very deeply whenever the topic of anti-Semitism rears its ugly and evil head, but particularly when that happens in American higher education. Secondly, as a graduate policy school that's committed so deeply to what we call viewpoint diversity in higher education as a way of preparing leaders for policy and politics that understand how the other side thinks. What we have witnessed in American higher education, and I might say in our graduate policy schools, several of them across the country, can only be called ideological monocultures, which have been revealed. We have trusted these institutions with preparing our next generation of public policy and political leaders, engaging in issues that are very much focused on the future of the Middle East. I know we ourselves have graduates, alumni from the School of Public Policy who are working in a variety of different positions, both in the media and in public policy in Israel and throughout the Middle East. How the future generations are prepared to engage in these positions should be of interest to all Americans. So without further ado, I want to turn this conversation over to my friend, Michael Helland, who will more deeply introduce our panel for today. And Michael, thanks so much.
Dean Peterson, a real pleasure to be collaborating with you again, and thanks for hosting us either this morning or this afternoon, depending on where we find you, in this very important and timely conversation. Pete and I were talking before that we originally tried to schedule this for a few weeks ago, and how much richer in some ways the conversation will be today because of recent events. I want to start by just expressing gratitude to two people I call friends, and two people, as soon as this topic came up, they were literally the first two people that came to mind, leaders, thought leaders within the American Jewish community, and who I'd like to have a conversation about campus speech and campus anti-Semitism, a topic that is on so many people's minds. Let me just, for those who have never had the pleasure of spending time um, with Yehuda Kurtzer and Elisa Lewin, let me spend a moment just to give a little bit more of an introduction, so you can understand why it is these were just immediately the first two people I reached out to. Elisa Lewin is the president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, a nonprofit organization established to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. Ms. Lewin is also a co-founder and partner in Lewin and Lewin, where she has specialized in litigation, mediation, and government relations. Her experience includes criminal defense, civil litigation, and discrimination matters, and has been an attorney in a variety of prominent Supreme Court cases. It seems relevant to mention where everyone went to university, given the topic of conversation. She received her BA from Princeton and a JD from New York University School of Law. Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews. He led the creation of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America in 2010 as a pioneering research and educational center for the leadership of the North American Jewish community. And he teaches in that institution many platforms for rabbis, lay leaders, Jewish professionals, and leaders of other faith communities. And again, his institutional affiliations: he received his doctorate in Jewish studies from Harvard University and an MA in religion from Brown University. I have scratched the surface of both your bios, but hopefully we'll give our audience a sense of who it is we have the opportunity to speak with this morning. Thank you so much again, both of you, for being here. I puzzled a bit about how to start this conversation, and I thought maybe the best way to do it would be to go back to October 6th. And here's what I wanted to ask both of you. Maybe we'll go in alphabetical order, so Yehuda, will start with you. I want you to take us back to the day before Hamas's horrific attack on Israel. And I want you to describe for us how you would have described the state of anti-Semitism on American university campuses before the events. What would you have said? And hopefully I'll ask Elisa the same question, and I'd like to use that as a way to think about what we think has changed. So maybe we'll start with that. I'll throw it to you, Yehuda. How would you have described the state of affairs on October 6th?
Great. Thanks for having me. And Elisa, it's good to meet you and good to be in conversation with you. I will say somewhat confessionally that I don't know that I would have had that well formulated an opinion prior to October 7th on the full state of affairs of anti-Semitism on the American college campus. I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is our institution has, in some ways, a historically earned allergy to conversations about anti-Semitism, not because it doesn't exist, not because we are in support of it, but because we've spent the bulk of our institutional history trying to get the Jewish people to talk about the things that we have control over, our destiny, our covenantal responsibilities, the work we're supposed to do around nation building, our values here as American Jews. And anti-Semitism is oftentimes an inconvenient conversation because it removes agency. It's the things that people believe about you. Jews don't create anti-Semitism; it's created around us and directed towards us. So it hasn't. I will say it has not been a huge feature of our work until now. I would say that I experienced and at the same time, our institution is physically adjacent to Columbia University. I would say we've watched and observed the conversation around anti-Semitism as kind of a slow hum or a low hum. In many ways, I think the way that most American Jews experience anti-Semitism. There's a lot of good data around college students that many American Jewish college students will say that they fear anti-Semitism on their campus. An equally high number say they have never experienced it directly. That probably changed since October 7th. And that has always felt kind of the state of affairs for anti-Semitism in general. In America, a lot of epigenetic and historically earned reasons why we should be cautious about it. We tend to read about the incidents and episodes quite carefully as Jews in America, but many of us don't experience it directly. And I would say if you were going to ask me around October 6th what the kind of temperature check is, that's how I would that's the statistic I would have gone for. We know it's there. It's definitely a real thing. Most American Jewish college students are not experiencing it, and therefore there's kind of an interesting gap to probe between what are we scared of and what actually materially presents itself as a threat.
Lisa, I want to ask you the question. I have a feeling you'll give a different answer given the nature of your work. So I'm super curious. How would you have described the state of affairs on October 6th?
The state of affairs on October 6th was we at the Brandeis Center were extraordinarily busy. We were already being stretched thin. Our organization provides support and guidance to students on campus who are experiencing anti-Semitism. And before October 6th, there already was a crisis on our campus. What happened post October 7th did not begin on October 7th. Right? The reason the anti-Semitism has spread like wildfire across our campuses, across the country, is because the earth has been primed for it. For years now, the communities on campus have been fed a constant diet of anti-Semitic propaganda that teaches that Zionists, right, certainly Israelis and any Jew that feels this affiliation for Israel, those individuals are supporters of genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass expulsion, death, evil. And so today now you have this explosion on campus that is, we had already seen Zionists being pushed out of spaces on campus. Now it's not just the Zionists, right? Now it's the Jews that are feeling that they cannot safely express their Jewish identity on campus today. I just came from a meeting today where somebody said to me, we need they've called the Waste Coast Standard. And I said, what's the Waste Coast Standard? And they showed me a photograph of a young man who had designed, this was at Eton, right, in England, the private high school, a waistcoat to go with his formal attire that has it basically looks like the Israeli flag on his waistcoat. It's got a large Magen David, blue and white. And they said, if you can't wear this waistcoat safely on campus, your campus is not a safe space for Jews. And we're seeing that now today. If a Jew can't walk around on campus, certainly with an Israeli flag draped over their shoulder without fear of being assaulted, but if a Jew on campus cannot safely express that part of their identity that celebrates the Jews' ancestral and ethnic heritage and connection to Israel, that campus is not a safe space for Jews. And you talk about what was life like on campus before October 6th. Versus after October 6th. We were already, as I say, stretched thin. In the first 3 weeks after October 7th, the Brandeis Center handled as many cases as we had handled in the prior 12 months combined. And as I say, those were a busy 12 months. It may be, right, Yehuda, and I welcome now this conversation. It may be that many students didn't realize that what they were experiencing was anti-Semitism. It reminds me about a survey years ago that I saw, which was trying to suggest that this whole notion of anti-Semitism on campus was overblown. And there was a survey that was asking students, have you experienced anti-Semitism? And they all said, no, we haven't experienced anti-Semitism. And then they said, well, have you as a Jew on campus ever been blamed for the actions of the Israeli government? And then there was some insanely high percentage, I think like 80%, that said, oh yeah, of course, right? But those students didn't even realize that if they were being blamed as Jews for the actions of the government of Israel, that is anti-Semitism. Right? So you may have had students before October 7th that didn't realize they were being that they were victims of anti-Semitism. Now, after October 7th, I think there's a greater realization. People are better able to see the anti-Semitism that's happening on campus for what it is.
So let me ask both of you, those were two completely different descriptions, I would say, of kind of what campus life looked like for American Jews before October 7th. So it feels, the world, to me certainly, and I suspect to both of you, but maybe not, feels completely different now, the university campus life. So how do you describe that when somebody asks you, like me, so what's different now? Like, what changed? How do you describe it? What do you think it is that has made things seem so deeply different? And let's go back to Yehuda and then Eliza.
Yeah, and I'll just say in response to what you said, Elisa, I wasn't disagreeing with what you then described empirically. I was telling you, giving an honest answer of where I and my institution's vantage point is with respect to this work. The October 7th shift is so significant in so many ways. I felt personally and institutionally for us. And I guess one way to put it is originally I kind of was, as I was trying to like make sense of things, it felt as though October 7th was an earthquake and American Jews were experiencing aftershocks of that earthquake. I no longer feel that that's the right metaphor. I actually think October 7th was an earthquake, and then there was a parallel earthquake, maybe stimulated by the tectonic plates, if you want to stick with the metaphor, maybe just taking place in some ways in parallel, but that what's happened here feels like an earthquake of its own consequence. And part of the reason I think that's an important thing to say is that the proximate causes of the political shifts in American Jewish life are not really about Israel and the Palestinians. They're actually about American Jewish and American non-Jewish political identity about Israel, which oftentimes is, and Palestine, which is oftentimes not about Israel-Palestine itself. So much of the protest culture in support of Palestinians since October 7th doesn't correlate with attitudes among Palestinians, either in Israel, in the West Bank, or Gaza. So there's something else happening here politically that purports to be about Israel-Palestine, but doesn't always correlate to Israel-Palestine itself. Um, I think, I think one easy way to articulate it is that I have long felt, and still believe to be the case, that um, that when the question gets asked, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, it's kind of a dumb question, because it's like asking, is an apple an orange? Well, no. But the more important question is, what properties, characteristics, traits do these share with one another? And to the extent that apple and orange is the wrong metaphor, the real question is, when does anti-Zionism converge into anti-Semitism? And I would say the big shift since October 7th is a huge amount of a lot of terrain got covered in the quest of anti-Zionism to actually approximate anti-Semitism. For all intents and purposes, almost all of the expressions that we're seeing today around anti-Zionism are, even if they're not anti-Semitism, are expressing themselves in ways that are dangerous to Jews and to others who hold those viewpoints, and therefore the distinction becomes almost irrelevant. And I thought the best example to this effect was when the world headquarters of Satmar take to Twitter. And by the way, Satmar has 0 followers who are actually Satmar on Twitter.
Yehuda, maybe tell our audience a little bit about Satmar.
Satmar is the kind of great legacy holdover of an ultra-Orthodox group that is ideologically anti-Zionist. And one of the ways that politically left anti-Zionists have made the case to the world that they can't be anti-Semites is that they point to ultra-Orthodox Jews who are also anti-Zionists and say, look, they're also anti-Zionists and they're clearly Jews in good standing, therefore anti-Zionism can't be anti-Semitic. So when Satmar, an ultra-Orthodox group, takes to Twitter and says, we want to make clear that our anti-Zionism is entirely a theological claim, and it should not be used by those who are attacking the state of Israel and its people to justify their own positions. That only happens because of October 7th, because they're also noticing the polarization between the anti-Zionist position and the mainstream Jewish position, which is Zionist, has become basically untenable. So I would say if you're looking for like, what's the major shift, I think that to me feels like the most significant evolution. And it happened, again, I think I'll defer to Eliza on this. Obviously, the currents of this have been brewing for a long time. We institutionally have been watching and studying this as well. But I think what's changed has been quite significant. I do hope we'll come back to one other consequence here, which I think is a positive one, which is that a whole bunch of progressive left-wing groups that are Zionist have, as a result of October 7th, re-articulated their commitment to the big tent and the mainstream. So it's not entirely a kind of exit to the left. It's actually more like a lot of clarity has emerged on the Jewish Zionist and anti-Zionist left that I think is actually quite useful.
Elisa, what would you say to this?
There are so many items that Yehuda has raised now that I would love to comment on. So I'll start first with just the question about post-October 7th. The main difference post-October 7th is that people are actually, many more people are actually starting to see the anti-Semitism that we have been trying to describe and explain has been there on campus all along. So what October 7th did is it has now brought it into stark relief. And I actually think there's a little bit of a silver lining in that, because you cannot begin to address the problem if you don't see and recognize that there even is a problem. Today, post-October 7th, people realize there's a problem. That's the first step to beginning to address the problem. One of the reasons that we've had this problem on the campuses for so long are, I would say, there are two main areas or issues that the university administrators do not understand. Number one is they do not understand Jewish identity. And number two, they don't understand anti-Semitism. So if you don't understand Jewish identity, you don't understand anti-Semitism, that's pretty much guaranteed that you're not going to be able to effectively address the anti-Semitism on your campus and protect the Jewish students. So when it comes to Jewish identity, overwhelmingly, university administrators, and this goes back right prior to October 7th, university administrators mistakenly think that Jews are just a religion. And therefore, they think that all they need to provide for Jewish students on campus is a Yom Kippur accommodation and kosher food, right? They need to make sure that they have what they need for religious practice. They don't understand the idea of Jews as a people. And now to get to the comment, right, even in terms of the Satmar, right? So what is it? Like most Jews today do not define their Jewish identity according to religious practice. You have many Jews, if not most Jews, who do not observe Shabbat. They do not keep kosher. Right? What is it that makes the Jews Jews? Right? They feel that they're part of a people. They feel they're part of the Jewish people. And what, if you to think about what the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks would talk about, our shared collective memory. Right? Think about how our holidays. What is it? We have our Passover Seder. It's because we, as the Jewish people, believe we're descended from those Jews who were once slaves in Egypt. Our holiday of Sukkot, we believe we are descended from those Jews who wandered in the desert for 40 years. We're celebrating Hanukkah right now, right? The Maccabee story, that's our story. I remember having a conversation with a student once who said to me, I grew up in a family, we did not observe Shabbat. We didn't keep kosher. She said, but I once played Queen Esther in my temple's Purim pageant. He said, oh, so the Purim story you is your heritage. Of course, right? That's our Jewish history. That's our Jewish heritage. That's our Jewish ancestry. It is impossible to separate the Jews' ancestral heritage from the land of Israel. Right? Over half of the 613 commandments in the Pentateuch actually relate to the land of Israel and can only be fulfilled in the land of Israel. So it's not only agricultural rules, but it had to do with the Sanhedrin, right? With the court system, with the temple and practices in the temple, with the kingship, right? With the whole idea of the Jewish people as a nation in that land, right? The idea of the Jewish people and the belief, right, that we have this shared ancestry and ethnicity that links us to this land, that is something that the Satmar Hasidim also recognize, that history and that ancestry. And in terms of the prayers and the tefillot, that once again in the future, someday, there'll be the ingathering of the exiles and the Jews will once again return to this land, that's very much a part of their Jewish identity as well. The political movement of Zionism, right, may be something that they were opposed to, but this idea that the Jews' shared ancestral and ethnic heritage is part of what defines us as Jews, that's part of our history, that is not something that they are opposed to, right? Right, if I talk about Zionists today who are not Satmar, may have a disagreement in terms of timing, right? In terms of when we believe that the Jews will all be together again in the Eretz Yisrael, right? But it's not a difference of the belief that this is the Jews' ancestral homeland. And so for Jews today who believe that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination in some borders in our ancestral homeland, that community of Jews today, right? That community of Jews today are being treated as pariahs on campus. And that's a form of anti-Semitism and harassment and discrimination that the university administrators don't get. They don't understand it, and they don't recognize it, in part because they also don't understand anti-Semitism. I can go into my little anti-Semitism 101, but maybe that'll be part of your next question. Right.
So, I can only imagine Yehuda has a lot to say on that subject as well. Although, interestingly, and Yehuda, I certainly don't want to speak for you, but so much of what Eliza just said sounds like so many things I've heard from you in the past. So, just an extraordinary, I'd say, convergence between the two of you. Let me ask the question this way, and maybe Yehuda will also give you an opportunity to say a little bit about comment on what Eliza just said. But so, can you diagnose? Eliza says part of this because administrators don't understand, but why has this happened on college campuses? It doesn't. I wouldn't say that it's completely different than American society, but it certainly looks a chunk different than what we see kind of in civil society in America generally. So, like, let's go back to you. How would you explain or describe, like, diagnose what's going on? Like, why has this happened on campus? Why are we seeing what we're seeing?
Yeah, I do think it's worth naming that at least some of what's happened publicly over the last few weeks, which may just be the tip of the iceberg, but there may also be some strange dynamics that are particular to elite universities, elite coastal campuses. I think there are probably, and I do agree with a lot of what Elisa, what you said. There's a total misapprehension on among university administrators of what Judaism is, and I think there's probably 3 or 4 reasons for that. I think one of them is it's probably reasonable, and some of these are generous. I think it's reasonable to conclude if you see certain radical politics on campus, you might be led to believe that that's more representative of the Jewish community than it actually is. So Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine have a radical articulation of what Judaism is and isn't. And I think it's reasonable that a university administrator who spent all their time on a university campus might come to the conclusion, well, that's if 30% of Jews think that, then it breaks down the notion of what is a deviant position. That's in general the sociological rules around deviance. Once it becomes kind of a critical mass of the people, you can't really refer to it as deviance anymore. So I think that's one variable. I think a second variable actually goes to American Jews and the project of Jewishness ourselves that we've been engaged with. The central push that many American Jews have ourselves made against religion, against our own tradition, has been one against the nationality and the national claims. We've been negotiating this for a long time. Obviously, Louis Brandeis tried to hold these two things together in the first part of the 20th century. Dual loyalties are only problematic if they are contradictory with one another. A person is a better Jew if they understand their nationality because of the circles of loyalty that were much more common in American identity in the first half of the 20th century than they are now. But I hesitate to say this, but I think it's true. Many American Jews could not come close to articulating with the sophistication that you did, Eliza, what it means as a Jew to hold on to some aspects of a religious tradition and at the same time to understand it as a nationality, to understand the dynamic, as we talk about at Hartman, between Exodus Jews and Genesis Jews, covenant Jews and family Jews, and that we are a people who has a religion that reaffirms our peoplehoodness. But that's actually strange. We've been a lot of American Jews have been kind of Protestantized in terms of our identity to, at minimum, separate between our religious and our national heritage and to emphasize one over the other. So that to me feels like another reason university administrators might come to that conclusion. And a third is that, universities, especially in the humanities, have become echo chambers of certain viewpoints around how religion is meant to be construed, around nationalism and how nationalism is meant to be construed, and they are odd places in that respect. So the idea of Judaism as this incredibly complex discourse of national identity, religious identity, cultural heritage, all of which is swimming together. It's just not an idea that has currency currently in the academy. So for all of these reasons, I think university administrators who I do not look at and say, I don't read the testimony on Capitol Hill and say, look at these anti-Semites. I don't think that's the story at all. I think it's a really unhelpful way of understanding what's taking place. I think they were ill prepared, but I think that mostly they come out of a very strange ecosystem, which is the American university campus, and therefore come to a certain set of conclusions about what Jewish identity actually means. And in that respect, I think they have a whole bunch of work to do. I think we as a Jewish community have a bunch of work to do, because if somebody comes along and says, I'm listening into your community, and this is what I've come to conclude about your community, then we have some questions to answer about what we're broadcasting as a Jewish community about our commitments.
I agree with that. I would also add that one of the pressures right now, and you see it, I think, increasing in the academic spaces, is a very determined effort to actually erase and deny the Jews' ancestral connection to the land of Israel. So, for example, the Palestine Rights Festival, and that's WRITES, that was held at the University of Pennsylvania just before Yom Kippur, was presumably a celebration of Palestinian culture and heritage. But if you go to take a look at their website, and they have a very fancy, elaborate website, and you want to understand the Palestinian heritage, you will see that the way they describe and define the Palestinian history and heritage is they basically say everything that has happened in this land, this holy land, this is Palestine from the time of creation onward. And there may have been Jews or Christians or Muslims who lived in this land, but they were all Palestinian. So, for example, if you had a temple on the Temple Mount, that wasn't a Jewish temple, that was a Palestinian temple. And if you are going to be considering that now a Jewish temple, you are now, the allegation is, Judaizing my Palestinian heritage. That's how you get UNESCO suggesting that Jericho or the Tomb of the Patriarchs are Palestinian heritage sites. And you have Hatem Bazian, who's a professor at Berkeley and who created Students for Justice in Palestine, getting up at a rally a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., where he announces that after October 7th, everything has changed. Everyone now, this is not going to end until we can go back to our olive trees and our lemon trees. Why? Because, he says, Palestinians have existed in this land since before existence began. And he says, we gave Abraham his green card when he came. He says from Iran. He should have said from Iraq. But he says, we gave him his green card. In other words, all of this is Palestinian heritage and history. And the idea that the Jews had a connection to this land, no, that doesn't exist. This, Ben Freeman coined a term, called it erasive anti-Semitism. We are seeing this now increasingly in the academic centers, where there is this insistence and denial and erasure of Jewish history, Jewish ancestry, Jewish heritage. I think, and we can get to, if we talk a bit about the legal arguments, I think part of the reason why this is happening is because there is an increasing understanding that the laws in this country protect Jews on the basis of our shared ancestral and ethnic heritage. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's now a concerted effort to try and undermine and deny our ancestral connection to the land of Israel.
I want to shift gears, kind of the way in which Eliza just described. I have a feeling Yehuda would like to say something right now, but Yehuda, I'm gonna ask you to work in your thoughts into the kind of this next piece of it. So great, not great, terrible, but I want to think for a second. Okay, so this is kind of the description of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism on campus and its relationship to anti-Zionism, the state of affairs, maybe how we got here, what's changed. So let me ask both of you. So what would you say the universities should be doing now? I mean, we all saw, maybe the best way to start with this is just to talk about the testimony, congressional testimony from last week. We saw 3 presidents of prominent universities respond to questions. And I guess I'm just curious. Let's start with, what was your reaction to that? I assume you both have watched it many, many times, certainly the clips on Twitter. What was your reaction? And maybe a little bit about what you thought they got right and got wrong. And maybe for this one, we'll start with you, Elisa.
So, I mean, I think that the problem, and it became crystal clear in these hearings, is that university administrators, one of the key problems is they don't understand anti-Semitism. And so they're at a loss to even understand how to address it. And so I am going to give my little anti-Semitism 101, right? Anti-Semitism may be society's oldest hatred, but it probably is one of the most difficult to recognize. And that's because anti-Semitism doesn't look the same in every generation. It morphs, it changes. There's one constant, however, about anti-Semitism, and that is that no matter the century, no matter the era, whatever that generation views as its misfortune, as the evil of the time, guess who's to blame? It's the Jew, right? The Jew becomes the scapegoat. So, and because this is a conspiracy theory, you can end up with squarely conflicting allegations. That's how you can end up with the allegations that the Jew is the communist and the Jew is the capitalist, right? The Nazis, they sought a pure Aryan race. The Jews were the ultimate race polluters. They certainly did not see the Jews as white. And yet today, when there are those who divide the world into the oppressed and the oppressors, the Jews all get lumped in with the oppressors. So if that means calling all Jews white supremacists or white colonialists, all Jews are now considered white. That is, again, right, labeling the Jew as the source of the evil. If the idea of anti-Semitism was that the Jews are the cause of our misfortune, then the implication is the world would be a better place without the Jews. Let's push the Jew out of acceptable society. So if you think about, for example, the yellow Star of David that the Nazis had the Jews wear, the idea was that Jew, you don't engage with that Jew, right? You shun them, you exclude them. You don't use them as your doctors or your lawyers or shop in their stores. They're to be denied their place in society. Today, we have not only individual Jews scattered around the world, we actually have a Jewish collective. We have a Jewish nation state of Israel. And if you understand how anti-Semitism works, then you can start to see, well, look at what's happened in the world today. If today's evils, right, the issues of the day are racism, apartheid, colonialism, there are those today who will say, which country is the world's worst offender when it comes to these offenses? Right? They don't say Iran or North Korea, right? They don't even say Hamas, right? Not a country, but they don't say China with the Uyghurs, they're treating the Uyghurs, or Russia with Ukraine. No, the world's worst offenders when it comes to today's evils, it's that Jewish state. That Jewish state of Israel is the one that folks will say is the world's worst offender, right? And then what's the idea? If, as I said, if traditional anti-Semitism, and Irwin Cutler, who's the former Justice Minister and Attorney General in Canada, just stepped down as the country's first anti-Semitism envoy, put it beautifully. He said, if traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society, this newer form of anti-Semitism seeks to do the same to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state of Israel. Right? It seeks to deny Israel its place in the society of nations. There's no other country in the world that's told it has no right to exist. Right? That is today's contemporary anti-Semitism, and yet most people, and certainly most university administrators, don't recognize it yet as anti-Semitism. So the problem is, right, these university administrators, they don't recognize the anti-Semitism that's taking place on your campus. They mistakenly think that what they're witnessing is a good faith political debate, but it's not. Right? The folks who are getting up on campus and supporting Hamas, which has publicly called for the end of Israel and the death of Jews around the world, right? That's not a starting point for a constructive dialogue on how to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. They're not interested in having a constructive dialogue on how to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? So if there were any other group on campus, they would never be trying to suggest that people should be engaging in a dialogue with those, if that's the starting point. Right? What these folks are doing is they're trying with these rallies, with these demonstrations, with these slogans to demonize Jews, to suggest that those Jews have no place on campus and to shun and marginalize those Jews. So what we need from the university administrators is not a statement about the politics, right? I don't need university administrators to weigh in on the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's not the statement we need. What we need from university administrators is for them to recognize that right now what's happening on campus is there's a community that's trying to pit students on campus against the Jews. And that's intolerable. The university administrators have to turn around and say, we have to be a space that is safe and welcoming for all. And we recognize that right now what's happening is the shunning, the marginalization, the demonization of Jews who define their Jewish identity as including Zionism as an integral component of their identity. And that's unacceptable on our campus. You want to have a debate? You can have a debate about the policies. Nobody's shying away from a debate about the policies. But first, you have to welcome and accept Jews and create a space on campus where Jews can fully engage with their full Jewish identity on campus. That's the issue, and that's what the universities have to recognize and have to start addressing.
Yehuda, how did you react when you watched the testimony?
Well, here's where I think, Elisa, our positions are going to diverge a little bit, because as you've characterized anti-Semitism on campus, I agreed with a lot of it. But as a description of the problem of anti-Semitism, I only think it tells half the story. To the extent that anti-Semitism presents as a kind of vehicle to express the inverse of what you consider the world's greatest problem or strength, I think you've characterized well anti-Semitism as it shows up on the political left. It's true, nationalism, colonialism, especially ethnic nationalism. Israel gets portrayed as being the singular representative of this evil in the world, and to the extent that the counter discourse on campus is the opposite, Israel gets excluded and isolated. It happens every day on social media and elsewhere. The problem is that in this country, that is only one expression of anti-Semitism, and in a highly polarized, highly partisan America, that means you have competing narratives among Americans on different political parties about which is the worst expression of anti-Semitism. So prior to October 7th, many people, myself included, the ADL, others, have been arguing that I find this kind of a dumb conversation, the worst expression of anti-Semitism, the one that has been more tied over the past decade to violent threats against Jews and Jewish institutions, has come from the far right. And it manifests as a response to, again, the same kind of worst evil representation, but the forces that are trying to take down America. The Great Replacement theory is a good example of this. This is what they marched around Charlottesville saying, Jews will not replace us. This is what the Pittsburgh shooter is motivated by, the perception that Jews are globalists, that they are trying to take down America. That motivates the Buffalo shooter. And therefore, I have essentially a consistent story on both ends. What's the worst evil that you see possible, and how do Jews represent the worst articulation of it? The problem then that we have as American Jews right now is that it means that the driver of anti-Semitism is not exclusively the right, it's not exclusively the left, it's actually hyperpartisanship, because what that's doing is it's positioning two worldviews against each other, both of whom using the Jews instrumentally, and actually dividing between the good Jews and the bad Jews. The thing that was most exasperating, there were two things that were most exasperating about that testimony last week. One was the kind of, I'll say this, the kind of diffidence and condescension that I felt from university administrators, the lack of preparedness to talk about this, and what underlies it is, as you said, an inability to understand the way anti-Semitism is operating on their campus. But the other side of it was watching the great representative on behalf of the Jewish people, Elise Stefanik, who herself has parroted Great Replacement theory stuff in her own politics. In her attacks against immigration, in her cozying up to former President Trump. There are ways in which you're talking about somebody who I personally was like, this is not the great defender of the Jewish people in America. This is someone who is effectively positioning the Jew as a means of scoring political points in Congress. So it wasn't I didn't just see, oh my goodness, these university administrators have no idea how anti-Semitism is proliferating on their campus. I also am watching this and saying, this is not good for us. This is not good for us to see our identities and our communities being portrayed as the source of a great divide between conservative and liberal Jews in America. I just don't think that in the long run, that's a winning strategy for us. So what I worry about is that the universities will respond to this in the short run because of pressure, a whole bunch of pressures, by doing some right things. How do we have to understand Jewishness differently? But that it will be viewed as a victory lap for those who have been trying to distance themselves from the anti-Semitism accusations by positioning to the other political party. Because ultimately, when two political parties are disagreeing about which anti-Semitism is worse, the one on their side or the one on the other side, they are not trying to fight anti-Semitism, they're trying to win elections. And in the long run, I feel that that whole formula is really bad for Jews in America.
So I agree. I mean, the anti-Semitism should not be a political issue. I think that what it demonstrates, though, is why we need a definition of anti-Semitism. And I will say that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism should be that definition. It is the only definition that has been developed and adopted not just by scholars. I mean, there are probably, by this point, there may be thousands, certainly hundreds of scholars, if not thousands, who have tried to come up with a definition of anti-Semitism over the generations. But this is the only definition that was developed over years by governmental bodies, right? The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is an international governmental body with government representatives. At the time was 31 countries, in addition to scholars. And so it was adopted unanimously by those 31 countries and by the additional countries that have joined the IRA. But one of the things that I think is really important when people go to try and understand the IRA definition is I always recommend that people go back to the 2010 State Department definition. So as many people don't realize that in 2010, the IRA definition came out 6 years later in 2016. But in 2010, this is during the Obama administration, was the first time that the United States adopted a definition of anti-Semitism. And the State Department adopted a definition that at that point was the working definition. It's based on the working definition of the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. And the definition is almost identical to the IRA definition. If you want to call it the black box definition, is identical. And then the IRA definition has a whole list of examples afterwards. All those examples are also in this 2010 definition. The main distinction is that the State Department definition has on its second page a heading that says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? Isn't that the question we're looking at today? So go back, you can actually find on the State Department website. If you go now, they use the IRA definition, but there's a hyperlink in the intro language to the 2010 definition. You can pull this up. And what it says is, and it makes clear in the 2010 definition, and there's language from that's in the IRA definition, which says that criticism of Israel criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be considered anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic. So we're not talking about criticizing the policies of the government of Israel. So what are we talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism? Well, what this 2010 State Department definition does is it says, what is anti-Semitism relative to Israel? Here are three categories. The first category is demonize Israel. The second is apply a double standard to Israel. And the third is delegitimize Israel. And then you can see the examples, they actually break out the examples to go under these three categories. So what is demonize Israel? When you're talking about, for example, the right-wing anti-Semitism, that tends to be, right, what we consider the traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Jew as greedy, as bloodthirsty, as controlling, as powerful, right? Those images, if instead of just applying to individual Jews, now you are depicting Israel, the Jewish collective that way, that's anti-Semitism relative to Israel. Applying a double standard to Israel would be like what we see at the United Nations, holding Israel to a higher standard than you hold any other country. You see that now with what's happening in Gaza, right? There is no other country in the world that spends hours on the phone trying to get civilians to empty and move out of buildings that are targeted before they actually bomb them, that are dropping leaflets, that are trying to get civilians to move out of a war zone. There's no other country that takes the kind of steps that Israel takes, and yet Israel is being held to a higher standard. And then there's delegitimize Israel. Delegitimize Israel is defined in the 2010. The example that's given is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination and denying Israel the right to exist. In the IRA definition, they talk about calling Israel a racist endeavor. In other words, if you're going to suggest that the Jewish people as a people have no right to self-determination, but you're promoting in the same breath self-determination for the Palestinian people or for others, then you're discriminating against Jews. You're treating the Jews differently than you are others. That is when the criticism of Israel crosses into anti-Semitism. And that's what our university administrators need to understand. That's what our politicians need to understand. That's what our society needs to understand. That's why we need a definition of anti-Semitism.
Let me I know our time is coming to a close, but let me kind of try to muster up the counter argument of all of this. The counter argument of all of this runs something like, yes, anti-Semitism is bad. Yes, what's going on in Israel is tragic. There's politics everywhere. This is very complicated. And universities are a place for people to have the opportunity to express their views on a wide range of topics. The idea that university administrators come in and say, here's what you can and can't say, here's what you can and can't protest. This is all a deeply misguided endeavor and is going to lead to the end of the university as a truth-seeking entity. I hope I did that about right. So how would each of you respond to that version of the counter argument that pushes back on the universities trying to get engaged and try to address what we're seeing on campus? And Yehuda, I'll start with you, and then Aliza.
Look, the problem really is not, I don't think it's an anti-Semitism problem. I think it's a larger problem of a question of what universities actually want to be. I'm not trying to dodge it, but I actually think that's the problem. Universities should be deeply uncomfortable places. I kind of believe that. We have called this productive discomfort. I believe that we should have a wide berth of opinions that should be allowed to be weighed out on campus on a whole variety of political positions and identities and so forth. And if Jewish students on campus have to defend the positions that they hold for around the state of Israel, I think in the right kind of university environment, that would be okay. The problem is the universities have, for the better part of the last couple of decades, been already engaged in constricting speech on campus, far more than is in their own interest. And there's a lot of reasons why they've done this. There's a political strategy involved with this. It reflects a certain politics. It reflects a certain understanding of young people and resilience, which I think is problematic. And universities are not actually teaching students how to debate in any sort of serious way. And as a result, what has happened is there's a whole bunch of restrictions already on what kind of things can and can't be said on the basis of this political position, this feature of your identity, this feature of your gender, et cetera. And now anti-Semitism appears to be a carved out exception. And as a result, what I fear will happen is the same culture will remain on college campuses, restrictions on this kind of speech, this kind of speech, this kind of speech. And now we're going to add a restriction around speech for Jews. And I think in the long run, that's a loser for everybody. I would love to see a larger interrogation prompted by the anti-Semitism moment that is about how do you create consistently a framework for the boundaries between legitimate speech and hate speech, and then have a kind of comprehensive analysis of all the different examples of how that's supposed to play out. But I'm worried that that won't be what will happen. I'm worried that instead we're going to get let's make sure that hate speech rules are meant to also include Jews who identify as Zionists, and I don't think that in the long run that helps the university system.
Yehuda, I want to just follow up on that for a second. I want to press you. So how does a university that has, as you described, the histories that so many of them do with respect to restrictions on certain kinds of expression or speech when it relates to various forms of affiliations and identities? I mean, that history doesn't go anywhere. So how do you move to a place of productive discomfort that doesn't feel like you're just kind of either adding to the list or not just creating a new exception and building around that? Like, given the history, is there any way out of it? I hope that question is clear enough. Or do we always feel like we have a legacy then, kind of given your description of, well, anti-Semitism was treated differently because it's just different than what's been in the past?
I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we've seen maybe a 30 or 40-year swing in a particular direction. And I don't think that the answer right now is to further that swing in that particular direction by now saying, well, we got all these other groups covered. Now let's make sure that the Jews are covered also. I think all that does is it contributes to a kind of chilling effect. I would love to see an attempt to kind of reverse some of the larger trends on speech in general on campus. I think campus should be testing grounds for the limits. I should really believe that should be testing grounds for the limits of free speech, because precisely because so few Americans live in genuinely pluralistic environments, we are relocating to live next to people we vote with, and therefore I would love to see the university to be the environment where pluralism is genuinely tested, and that's going to require us to actually be more lenient on speech than restrictive. I only think that the only reason we as Jews would want to go along with that is if we saw that possibility be playing out with respect to other groups. So that's what I would want to see happen.
Aliza, I have a feeling, call me crazy, that you have a different view on this subject.
I think that we want robust debate about ideas. We must oppose forcefully the dehumanization of people, of individuals, right? That's the problem. For many, if not most Jews, Zionism is not a viewpoint. That's what people have to begin to understand. I define my identity, my Jewish identity, as including Zionism as an integral part of that identity. I believe that my history, my ancestry, my prayers, my people have begun in this place, have yearned to return to this place, have throughout history demonstrated their connection to this place over and over and over again. This defines my Jewishness, right? Not all Jews are Zionists, but by the same token, not all Jews are Sabbath observers. And yet if you ask somebody who incorporates any kind of Shabbat observance into their life, they'll tell you that's an expression of their Jewish identity. By the same token, you ask an individual who feels this connection to Israel, they may be highly critical of the current policies of the government of Israel. They may be very anti-Bibi Netanyahu. It doesn't matter. If they celebrate this part of their ancestral heritage, they are the Zionists and they are treated as pariahs. That is demonizing and dehumanizing Jews as Jews. That's not a debate about ideas. You want to debate ideas? Absolutely. Let's debate the ideas. That's the kind of robust conversation we need to have on campus. But campuses must stand firmly against the dehumanization, the disparagement, the shunning, the marginalization, the exclusion. What's happening today on campuses is Jews are being pushed out. They are being pushed out of spaces. 2 years ago, we had a student who folks were calling for her impeachment from student government purely because she was a Zionist. Just the other day, I heard now from another student who's going to be in and is being threatened now with the same type of thing at the University of Vermont. And we didn't get to the legal discussions, right? The University of Vermont, we filed an administrative complaint with the Department of Education because what was happening on their campus, they had a sexual assault survivor support group that announced in 2021, after the last Gaza conflict, this was the largest support group on campus, and they announced they're blocking Zionists. When Jewish students tried to reach out to this support group, they were told, we don't talk to Zionists. Jewish students, you're out. There was a book club, the Revolutionary Socialist Union Book Club, that said to be part of this book club, which had a uvm.edu website, you had to pledge no to racism, homophobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, all the phobias. You also had to pledge no to anti-Semitism to be part of this book club. But in addition, you had to pledge no to Zionism to be part of the book club. And then you had a teaching assistant at University of Vermont who loved to just cyberbully and harass Zionists online. She would even she posted about the serotonin rush she would get bullying Zionists in the public domain. And she tweeted once, quote, "Is it ethical for me, a TA, to deny participation credit to Zionists? I think it would be good and funny. -5 points for going on Birthright in 2018, -10 points for posting a pic of yourself with a tank in the Golan Heights, or -2 points just because I hate your vibe in general." This was the nature of the anti-Semitism going on at UVM. And when the Department of Education negotiated a resolution agreement with the university, which is how most of these resolve, because the risk to the universities if they don't negotiate a settlement is they could potentially lose their federal funding, and they don't want to. So as part of that resolution agreement, the University of Vermont had to agree to modify its anti-discrimination policies and its training, among other things, to address this form of anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. And how did the Department of Education refer to this? They referred to it as a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. That's the point. National origin discrimination no longer means, and shouldn't mean, just, oh, you're born in Israel, you can't discriminate against an Israeli. The idea of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry is now the idea that the Jews are a people. The Jews have a shared ancestral and ethnic heritage, and if you're going to target or discriminate or exclude or marginalize Jews on that basis, that is a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. Title VI requires, obligates the universities to protect their students from that kind of harassment and exclusion, and the university administrators have to learn to recognize it and to take effective steps to combat it. Because I will tell you, the guidance from the Department of Education requires universities, when they find this kind of harassment, they have to, 1, end the harassment, 2, address the hostile environment that's been created by the harassment, and 3, prevent the harassment from reoccurring. That's the standard that the universities are being held to, and that's the standard they have to meet.
Well, I see our time. I have so many more questions I would like to ask you. Here's my fervent hope and prayer that Yehuda and Lisa, I understand that you've never met before. I hope this is the first of many meetings and the first of many conversations. Grateful to both of you to spending time with us here today.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Dean Peterson. And Yehuda, it's been a pleasure to meet you this way, and I hope we can continue our conversation.
Thank you.
I'll just add in closing, again, just add my own gratitude for all of you for participating in this important conversation. I do suppose, though, and this is something that Yehuda, you brought up, that I wish it weren't the case that we may have similar conversations months into the future based on things that are happening on college campuses, but I'm afraid that this is an issue that is going to continue. And I think in part it's going to continue based on the confluence of both of the cases that you've both raised here, Eliza and Yehuda. Yehuda, the point that you raised about the ideological nature of today's anti-Semitism, where we're seeing that peculiarly on America's college campuses, I do really think is worth addressing. As we may take on debates about decisions made by the Israeli government on particular policies, that's one thing, but we also need to examine this pervasive anti-colonialism, the issues around nationalism and identity as being ipso facto evils. I think about Natan Sharansky's book on identity, in which he makes just a very compelling case for the uniqueness of Israel and its both ethnic and religious identity. And if there is not a space for Israel in this world, if we're going to argue it out of existence and attack it out of existence, we are losing even more than just the state of Israel. We're losing part of our humanity, our joint and shared humanity. And these have implications not only for who we are as human beings, but who we are as Americans. And again, I really do hope, I'm starting to see more and more attacks on social media from some of my friends on the right, just making this about the DEI industrial complex. This is a lot bigger than this. You could respond in ways of reforming all the DEI administrations on college campuses and not get at some of these deeper philosophical and these deeper anti-Semitic issues, which, as you've said, Eliza, predate October 7th. Again, please know that you have friends here at Pepperdine, not only the School of Public Policy, but again, Michael, I'm just so grateful for our friendship and the ability to convene conversations like this. And I look forward to continuing to follow these events, not only as they relate to foreign policy issues, which we care a lot about here at the Policy School, but also what's happening on our college campuses. So again, thank you, all of you, for this important conversation.